And here we go. The band consists of Tom Park, clearly visible on the right. Tom is the host in the background and also the head of our software development team looking after facts and other dangerous things. But of course, Tobias is key here. And Tobias, you are on the trumpet today, correct? And you've even got the instrument to prove that we mean business. Then we have infamous Kert, Viele on the drums, the clarinet if must be, but drums it'll be today. And here we have our bass player, Andy Grieve. And we have myself in a photograph taken by Andy some 30 years ago. I'm not sure if I'm keyboards or just destructive element in the background. But most importantly, here she comes, our lead vocal, Perevozskaya. And so that's the band. So what we want to do is to have an hour of a good, fun discussion about why simulate. But the real topic here is to debate on how we can empower ourselves to be impactful on a strategy setting in development planning for pharmaceutical investigational drugs, but also for devices, anything that's to do with R&D in biomedical sciences. Let's have fun. This is going to be a round table at all times. There'll be some slides in the background, but they really just serve for stimulation of thought purposes. Once I'm done in my introductory thing, maybe we just quickly go around the table on folks here who are panelists. Maybe you can talk about what you do, maybe your first memory on simulations in clinical trial design, and something people may not know about you. And then I'm going to show some slides to set the scene, and then we'll have the discussion. But instead of having just a minute where we are forced to speak all the way to a minute, we'll be concise in our points. And we'll still try to not hesitate, not to repeat ourselves and not deviate from the topic. Let's see how that goes. There'll be Chopin, the minute waltzes at the end. And then to the audience, please fire off questions at all times via the chat function within Zoom. I'm going to try and look at what question might come up, and we'll weave that immediately into the discussion. Tom, if you can also help me and everybody else in achieving this. So, hey, without further ado, why don't we go around the table? Ina, you make a start. Who are you? What do you do? How did you come to simulations in clinical trial design, and something that people might not know about you?
Thank you, Mike. That's an honor. And I'll start by saying that it's an honor to be in the present company. It's actually a rare coincidence. Statistically, I don't know how likely or not, but all the people on the panel today had privilege of working, and it's rare for us to get together this day. So thank you for inviting me. I'm currently at BMS. I lead Statistical Innovation Group there, or Statistical Methodology. Sometimes it's a little bit of both. Before that, I did a similar job. In fact, I started my innovation journey, Mike, under your leadership when the adaptive designs were just kicked and brought into spotlight, and have about 20 years of pharma experience, primarily focusing on methodology innovation. How I got in simulation, I guess that answers the question. All the guilty parties is here. I have a hobby outside of the simulation. Some of you may know it, maybe not everyone, that I do ballroom dancing. I'm married to a professional ballroom dancer, and together we have a dance studio in Philadelphia area. Perhaps that part is less known.
You're underselling it. And, we had a big meeting once full of statisticians, mathematicians, modelers, and what have you. And I invited you too, but then in your capacity.
Yes.
Amazing dancer together with your husband and others. Yes.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. And that's all probably.
Cool. And hey, Tobias.
Yeah, hey. I'm Tobias Mielke. I am a methodologist at J&J. I'm here since about 7 years, and Mike was the one who hired me to J&J so that I could do simulations there. I'm actually a mathematician, and the first time I used simulations, it was during my PhD, not to simulate clinical trial outcomes, but actually to integrate, to make some stochastic integration. So that's one of the uses of simulations, which is quite useful. When I'm not simulating, when I'm not thinking about simulations or dreaming about them, I am playing the trumpet, for example, or I'm running around in the neighborhood because I really like staying a bit in shape. But that's now and then not so easy. So sometimes it's also helpful to just simulate the running. That's all from my end at this point. Thanks.
Very good. Kurt.
Hi, I'm Kert Viele. I'm the Director of Research at Berry Consultants. I have been Berry Consultants for 15 years. I got into simulation when Scott Berry took me out of being a faculty member and told me to learn clinical trials and program facts. So I learned most of what I know about clinical trials from times where I thought facts was wrong and it was me that was wrong. Let's see. On my extra fact, my wife has an extensive fossil collection. We're amateur paleontologists, and so we've had the experience of telling our Labrador Retriever, leave that bone alone. It's 70 million years old.
Wow. Tom, you're not supposed to speak, but why don't you also tell us who you are and why you are sitting there silently in the background?
Well, thanks, Mike. So I joined Berry Consultants 10 years ago, but I started on this journey 25 years ago, or a little bit over, when I first met Mike and Andy Grieve to work on a clinical trial project that they were running at Pfizer. I had never done clinical trials. I had never done Bayesian statistics. I didn't know what a Gibbs sampler was. The only way I could understand what the heck was going on was by looking at the simulations that you guys were running and looking at them individually and saying, oh, that's how the trial behaves. So for 25 years, that's how I've been understanding clinical trials and clinical trial statistics, is by looking at simulations. I have nothing interesting about me, but my wife, who used to be a really high-powered director of HR, is now a fully qualified and really excellent yoga teacher. So that's what I spend my time doing, is being taught.
You might need her after this hour is over. So thank you. And last but not least, Andy himself, Andy Grieve.
Well, thank you for inviting me to this event. It's a great honor to be with you all. I first used simulation in my undergraduate project. I was simulating different types of control schemes, so quality control schemes, under mixture distributions. And then when I was doing a master's, I also used simulation looking at properties of tests in time series. But of course, in terms of adaptive clinical trials, which where I met most of the other people on the webinar, I first, in fact, designed an adaptive clinical trial and simulated it in 1984. That's over 40 years ago. And it was very unusual 40 years ago to be considering adaptive clinical trials. But even at that stage, we needed to simulate to understand the operating characteristics of the design. It's been a long journey since then. And there's been some mention of the clinical trial that Mike and Tom and I were involved in 25 years ago. And I think that was really where my interest in simulating clinical trials began.
Yes, and Andy, we have a special relationship. It all started with me asking, do you have 5 minutes? And now it's many decades later and we are still talking. However, not always very friendly. Here you inform the world that maths was never your strong point, Andy says to Mike. And that's because I had written a little note in Facebook to celebrate my mom's 93rd birthday and asked her to put together a list of desert island things, all things that she had played herself. She's an organist and harpsichord player. And of course, I put 9 in there, and you're not only allowed 9, you're only allowed 8. And, counting is not my forte, but breaking the rules is. I'm a clinician by background, worked with Andy when we both were at Pfizer, and have since graduated to being very interested in model-informed drug development. And I've worked with many amazing people applying out-of-the-box thinking to drug development strategies. And, why simulate? It's a question that is the title of this seminar. And when I tried to make the point early on at Pfizer, I showed these pictures of fancy products of engineering, cars or planes, and showed circumstances that might be best looked at in silico before you try it out in real life. And then it occurred to me that when I started in clinical research in the 90s, a clinical trial was conducted as if it was a car that was just built and then you put the passengers into it, or a plane that was just built, but you never tried it out before. And quite an interesting concept. And I was fascinated by observing engineers who produced planes in those days. In the 90s, they all spoke about jumbo jets, very big ones. The A380 Airbus was an idea, but would it really come together? And it occurred to me that, in those industries, there are years spent before a product is finalized. And the question was, when I joined Pfizer in clinical development, isn't it possible to do something similar in clinical drug development? And then I came across this article a certain Don Barry wrote, and I imagined him to be this professor with a long white beard who was so eminent that you wouldn't possibly be allowed to ever talk to him. But I read this article and I was struck by how nicely he explained to lay people like myself. I'm a medic. I'm really not very strong technically in statistics or mathematics or any of that, but it really resonated with what he spoke about. I had no idea what Bayesian was or frequentist was. I just read what he wrote, and I invited him. And of course, at in the UK where we were, Andy and I, we had a short course then on Bayesian statistics. And Andy obviously was my partner in crime. We worked for the same company and we had an opportunity. And Andy, I wondered whether you could perhaps quickly articulate the case that we made to have to be different in our thinking about establishing the correct dose and treatment regimen for a stroke trial that we were involved with at the time.
Yeah, sure. I think that you and I, Mike, were on a project at Pfizer looking at how successful or not Pfizer had been in establishing the appropriate doses for phase 3 clinical trials based on phase 2 studies. And historically, Pfizer had been pretty poor at achieving the best or a sensible dose estimate for phase 3. And in particular, one trial that one development program that I remember from that project was a drug for osteoarthritis, in which Pfizer had ended up running one after the other 3 dose response studies, largely because they had only, 2 reasons. One, they had only chosen a small number of doses to investigate in the first study, and they ended up being on the plateau of the dose response curve. They did a second trial and they still remained on the plateau of the dose response curve. And so they did a third trial where they managed to find a no effective dose and things went better. But that sort of got us thinking about how we could do things better. And one of the ideas was to choose more doses. But if you're going to choose more doses with large numbers of patients per group, that can end up being a very large clinical trial. And so the idea came about that perhaps we would want to adapt the randomization to that part of the dose response curve that we were interested in, which is the increasing part of the dose response curve. So that's how we started.
Yeah, and I recall how you were able to stand in front of senior management and articulate the case for having more doses. And it was, apart from your technical expertise, really impressive to see, but also an eye-opener to see how relevant it was to articulate clearly and communicate to the decision makers. That was really an amazing.
Well, I think that's right, and I think one of the lessons from that is you really have to target the audience that you're talking to. So, if we wanted to show how technically clever we were talking to an audience of statisticians, that's one talk you would give. But in terms of influencing decision makers within a pharmaceutical company, if you gave the technical talk, you would lose them within 2 minutes. And you wouldn't achieve what you wanted to. In this particular case, what we wanted to show was that by doing it the way we were proposing, we would have a greater chance of coming up with a positive outcome, and there would be saving of money. There would be saving of the bottom line. And that, of course, is very important for the decision makers.
Yeah, and we want to come back to this topic of the importance of articulating clearly and communication and influencing skills. Inna, when you think, and everybody else will just make a roundtable about this, when you think about your experience in drug development, surely the need to identify the correct dose and treatment regimen is still a topic and has always been. What is your thinking about the benefits of simulating different design options and looking at which one might be best to answer the question? What is your experience? Anything to share?
Absolutely. First of all, I have to say I absolutely agree with Andy about importance of articulating the value of these designs to non-statistical stakeholders. For me, even 20 years later, it still remains a challenge, and I would consider that a harder problem than actually cracking the simulation. And by the way, this is the trial I learned adaptive designs on. And 10 years later or 15 years later, it still remains a problem. What I see a lot is that due to the cost-cutting pressures, we often are pushed to run very small dose-ranging studies or sometimes skip them completely. And yet, it may lead to all this, payback later down the road that when we don't get the dose right. So I would say the need to understand how this trial behaves is still very strong, and our intuition can trick us. And that's, I think, where simulations and making these things tangible and accessible to non-statistical stakeholders, particularly clinicians, being able to show how it plays out, I think, is very powerful in convincing people to use these designs.
Yeah, Kert, any experiences that you want to bring in on learning about the dose response and the value of applying simulation-guided clinical trial design to it?
Definitely. So I agree with Andy and Inna. I think one thing that we're doing more and more these days is simulating programs in addition to simulating trials. So it was mentioned, if you get the wrong dose, your phase 3 trial is going to fail. It's worth thinking through and simulating phase 2 and phase 3 together and going, what is the chance that you're successful? A result of telling people, oh, there's a 60% chance you're going to pick the right dose is one thing. A statement where there's a 40% chance you're going to waste $300 million on your phase 3 is a lot more impactful. We've also done simulations of phase 1, 2, and 3, where we found situations where just changing phase 1 and a few more patients, a better chance of getting the MTD. We've shown situations where if you do it what we'll call the standard way, there's maybe a 40% chance you're going to get through phase 1, 2, and 3. Do a few tweaks in phase 1, make it a little bit better, get a better dose, you may increase that to 55 or 60%. They're meaningful differences, and a lot of times the real impact is down the road. It doesn't mean you have to do the phase 3 trial you're simulating, but just always be thinking ahead and prepare yourself for that next step.
So a real critical point, and we'll come back to this, looking at the bigger picture, not looking in a myopic way at just one trial in isolation, but looking at the development strategy and the concept of considering doing things seamlessly. And we'll come back to that. Tobias, in your experience, dose response, identifying the correct dose to move forward, and simulations around this.
I have another thing. I would like to ask you a question, Mike, because you are the clinician. So you are running your study and you know your drug is the best drug. That's what you always believe. The phase 2 study fails. What are you doing?
So this is a super interesting point. As the clinical leader in a compound development team, my experience has been I was always very much a champion for my compound. And so I would work very hard to find reasons why the study may have failed and why we should continue to invest. So there was a very strong bias in my entire career when I was accountable for an individual project to be the key project champion. So that's the honest answer to your question.
Exactly. That's the honest answer which I expected you to give. So the point is, it happens that phase 2 studies now and then fail. And what frequently happens is that we are asked as statisticians to look now into subgroups and any kind of reasons why it might have failed. And what comes out is possibly a decision that, hey, there is a subgroup and we need to just move this cutoff to X, Y, Z, and then we have a very, very good drug. And I think that is something what is best played through with a clinician through simulations. You just simulate the trials under the null hypothesis. So if there is no effect, you show the results to the clinicians asking, what would you do now? What would you think? And you will see those kind of situations where there is something, you pick up a covariate where you have a treatment effect interaction. And now you tell them later, well, you know, this was just a fluke. That was just a null hypothesis which I simulated. And I think that's a very big power of simulations. You can go into the situation, you can explain how we are being tricked by some data and how we come up later with explanations. And I think that's what simulations are helpful for. So let's try and understand it earlier and then design the trial so that we have prospectively defined the subgroups, have prospectively addressed those potential questions. So that's, I think, what I would take from why simulate and how to use them possibly.
Yep.
Can I interject with a first couple of questions from the audience? So I think that the first one, I'm going to not quite take them in time order. The first one I think is nice and general, which is, can simulations of an adaptive trial be way off when compared to the actual trial? And if so, what would you say was the best way to simulate to simulate the unexpected and try and anticipate that?
In my experience, the beauty about running simulations is you ask around the table of all the content experts that need to be part of this discussion, what assumptions should we make? And let's look at extreme bookends. And it's actually desirable to think about a wide range of different scenarios and then test out the different scenarios. Others chime in onto that question. Tobias?
I think the question is very interesting. And Stefan, thanks very much for asking it. The point is, in an adaptive design, you see that it may be way off, so you still have the chance to react. But what about the trial which was not designed adaptively and it was way off and you just recognize it at the very, very end? I mean, that's the part which is more tricky. And that's exactly why we use simulations. We have assumptions which Mike is pointing to. We want to understand how is the adaptive design really mitigating the risks. So that's really why we would like to have the adaptation.
I think it's also possible that the statistical technique can be way off. It's not just the assumptions about the drug. And I think there has been, and I'm sure it's less than it was 20, 30 years ago, there's been too much of a concentration on the aggregate outcomes of simulations rather than looking at the simulation of an individual clinical trial. And there's much more information to be gained by looking at individual simulations rather than aggregating the outcome. It may look on average fine, but there may be very many individual clinical trials within the average that look very poor, and that's something that we have to be aware of.
Yeah, Inna.
Just to add maybe to that point, I think doing simulation prior to the trial helps us to build the discipline to hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. Speaking of this individual runs, average is a good measure that usually appeals to statisticians, but it does not necessarily capture the worst case scenarios. No one worries about the best case scenarios, but we need to be prepared for the worst case scenarios, and that's what simulation helps to address.
Yeah, Tobias.
Just 10 seconds. And then to add on the average, I mean, the average sample size in group sequential design, you never see it because it's either early stop or later stop. So that's what you need to also show, and that's what simulations can do. So it's better from the perspective of showing the individual runs and understanding the distribution behind the decisions. So that's really to agree with Andy and with
Kert.
So I'm going to say, and agree with everything that's been said, it is hard to figure out what the unknowns are in advance by definition. I think that a couple things, as you get experience, you start to learn what's going to cause trouble. In an adaptive trial, for example, accrual is often something people who haven't done adaptive before, the accrual rate of the trial is really impactful. And knowing that, as you get more experience, you get used to that. The other thing that I would, as a fail-safe, is making sure that your DSMB knows how adaptive trials work and what's in danger and not. I was involved in a DSMB many years ago. The trial accrued way too fast, and the DSMB both recommended to get rid of the adaptive features and to get rid of some hierarchical borrowing features. And the adaptive features were certainly going to be messed up from the fast accrual, but the hierarchical modeling piece was completely unaffected. And anyway, it's good to have people who know, oh, I'm running into this problem. How do I make a surgical change in order to make this still stay on the rails?
So
Kurt,
I'm going to generalize what you said. Communicating key ingredients of how we work to critical stakeholders is so important. You mentioned DSMB, but there are other circumstances. So we come back to this. Be clear about what the key ingredients are and be super strong in articulating and communicating them clearly. Well, this is what Don and Andy helped us with this trial that we worked on, the Aston stroke trial, many years ago. And Don eventually arranged for us to present at a workshop at Carnegie Mellon. And what we presented was really 2 years worth of thinking, which is very unusual in the setting that I've since experienced in drug development. But that evening, Tom, you were there. You recall, it was just an extraordinary feast to be able to say, hey, we've done this. But of course, you don't always have many months, let alone years, to think about this. And Andy, you came up with this infamous graphic. Do you quickly want to mention not the content of it? People know it, but what impact it has had to clearly illustrate some of what the trial tried to do to senior management and external environments, including health authorities?
Well, I think it has been very impactful. In fact, that graphic on the left, which comes from a paper which you and I published, Mike, later, the original version of it that we showed at the Carnegie Mellon conference that you mentioned, years later, it appeared on the front of a clinical pharmacology book. And I contacted the author and I said, where did you get this from? And he said that he had seen it in different sets of slides in 3 different pharmaceutical companies that he'd worked in. And so what that shows is the impact of the idea, not the technical side of it, but the impact of the idea, the learning cycle that we were implementing in that trial.
Yeah. And to the right of it, I copied and pasted from the GBM Agile webpage the flowchart that illustrates how that very innovative seamless phase 2/3 study is going. So the impact of articulating clearly to stakeholders is just amazing. But this is how we worked in those days. And Andy, I recall you giving a presentation. There were 1 or 2 slides where you gave a warning to senior management that our work was at risk because the number crunching power wasn't good enough in those days. So here you look at all the laptops that we could steal. We put them into a secret room. You can see this cardboard boxes so that nobody can see what we did. And, over a weekend, usually took 2 or 3 days, we would run the code that was freshly programmed by Peter Müller. And it would take days to number crunch this through. And it was very, very labor intensive to then aggregate the output, etc. So that's 1990.
There was an important learning on that, Mike. When we set out to do those simulations, we had a meeting of the statisticians, and I asked them to come up with the scenarios that they thought we should investigate. And I think we came up with 1,200 different scenarios. And we estimated it would take 9 months to run the simulations. Well, that was infeasible. And so what we did was we decided to design it as our own experiment. Statisticians are very good at being critical of other people's experiments and saying you haven't designed it very well, and there's this failure and this failure. And what we actually did was to say simulations are the statistician's experiment, and we can take account of standard design of experiment ideas to reduce the number of simulations that we had to do, or scenarios. And we ended up doing 90 scenarios in a fractional factorial design. And I think that's something that we should be doing more often even today, even with the increased power. It doesn't mean that we should necessarily be inefficient in the way that we do the simulations.
Yes, and Ina, I want to pick on you because you mentioned a paper that you put together with Christina on best practices around how to think about simulations. But I do want to point out the fire extinguisher. It wasn't clear to us, but over the weekend, I closed the door and there was a little paper in there. The temperature went up dramatically. I mean, it really was quite hot in there. And boy, was it a thing. Anyhow, Ina, why don't you summarize some of the insights that you put into this paper, best practices, simulations?
Sure. I actually have to make a disclosure that first, when Christiana approached me about this project, I wasn't a firm believer that anyone is ever going to read it. I was really, really wrong. I'm glad she convinced me, because to fast forward a little bit, the paper, after it has been complete, was selected as a best paper in stat and biofarm research. But I think, going back to the original question, I think there was a business need in organization where Christiana was, and pretty much in every organization, to treat simulation as an experiment, the point that Andy made just a couple of minutes ago. Because even though we do have all this computing power today, it still takes human time to process and digest and make sense of the computer simulations. And anyone who's gone through that cycle probably knows that that's the main bottleneck in your timelines. Designing airplane, car, or clinical trial is an iterative process where you simulate, you process, you go back to stakeholders, maybe you come up with new ideas. So essentially the paper was designed to summarize experience with several statisticians designing adaptive trials. And we kind of broken down by the type of adaptive design, because the type of simulation you would run in a dose ranging trial that you just presented, Mike, would be very different from, let's say, later stage sample size re-estimation type of design, where it's a hypothesis testing framework and not an estimation. These are different statistical designs, and the simulation as an experiment needs to be planned accordingly. It gets even more important with the complex innovative design, where operating characteristics or performance of the design, type 1, type 2 error, are not available analytically, so you have to prove it by simulation. And then that just raises the bar for the rigor how we structure our simulation to make sure we really covered it.
Yeah. Kurt.
So to build on that point, I think one of the difficulties in doing complex designs that require simulation is this notion of, Andy was talking about the bottleneck in doing the simulations. I think one of the bottlenecks right now is being able to get the results and present them fast enough to affect the decision process. So the notion of coming into a meeting and going, it's going to take me 2 weeks to get you graphs and everything. A lot of times, if you're in the meeting with decision makers, I want to decide what we're going to do now and move to the next problem. So I think I will put it as a challenge to the greater community that what we need right now is more and more how to do this quickly in terms of processing results. We know that we need to do more details and so on. But the level that you need to make a decision, we're going to pursue an adaptive design. We want to be able to have that information in front of people as quickly as possible, and we can fill in the details later once the decision makers are committed to this path.
It's a critical point. So time to the adaptive design report, and it's a structured document, and it's not going to only appear after the decision has already been taken. Kurt, I want to also ask you, because you when we prepared for this, you had this thing about a misconception around simulations. Like you have 4 ideas about designs, A, B, C, D, and then you do a simulation on each of them, and then the job is done. But the way you think about it is quite different.
Yeah. So the conversation that we were having was reflecting there's one workflow here where you could say, I'm going to use simulation. We're going to sit in a room. We're going to write out 4 possible designs. We'll go simulate them, and then we'll decide which of those 4 possibilities we're going to go with. And that's certainly reasonable. I think it's better, and you'll get to a much stronger place if you view this as an iterative process where here are the 4 ideas I'm able to come up with right now. We're going to simulate them. I want to come back to Andy's point about individual trials within each of those, because those are crucial to making things better. But going through the trial as a whole, going through the individual trials, it's often designs E, F, and G that weren't in your initial set of 4 that are the one that you ought to be choosing. And you need to be going through what I'll call these inspiration simulations in order to get to that result, which are different than what I'd write up for the FDA, where here's all the type 1 errors and everything else. That's a different set of goals you're solving at that point.
Yep. Tom.
The second question from the audience. What differences are there for simulations of clinical trials for rare diseases? And perhaps expand on that are there types of trial or types of indication which change the game somewhat for doing the simulations and make it different?
So there's a whole paper that Don Berry produced about Bayesian statistics in rare diseases. But rather than me commenting on that, anybody else wants to answer that question? Rare diseases simulations.
So maybe going in this direction, a few years ago, we had this EU Pearl initiative, which was specific on the design of platform trials. And platform trials are one approach to address rare diseases and to learn more on rare diseases by having combined trials in those. And there, what we understood in the simulations, that goes also to the points by Kert, Ina, and Andy, is that this whole process of simulating something, simulating a design, we call it a vanilla design, a very simple design. You understand what is missing. You understand where the design isn't working, and you start adapting the design. It's really this iterative process, which brings you to new ideas and which brings you to a better understanding of actually the assumptions. And the assumptions are what is very critical also then for this rare disease. You need to understand what you have and how to learn more.
Yep. And hey, Tom, when you, or Kurt, when you mentioned and others looking at an individual trial, Tom, when you introduced me to the FACTS software, one of the critical things there, apart from it being very fast in simulating, is you can actually look at individual simulation runs, which is something that in those days, 99, we needed to do a lot of handwork to do that. I want to mention the surprise of Peter Müller, who was the ingenious person putting together the code. He eventually, I think, joined Don's setup at MD Anderson and learned about other trials that were done. And Don once told me that Peter was really surprised after having worked with us for a couple of years that there was such a thing, a clinical trial where you didn't have the same interest of simulating. So, he was biased in the exact opposite way of many others who would think, why should I even simulate? And I just want to highlight that 99, we had all these laptops hidden in a back door, and now you have this QR code and you can download a piece of software. And it won't answer all questions, even though it would be great if it could deal with all things that you could possibly come up with. But what a move forward compared to then, and what an easy way to get your hands on. So try this out if you want. Now,
I need to say, Mike, that I sympathize with Peter. Scott Berry did that to me too. Very, very cruel.
Okay. And the other thing that I wanted to highlight, had you told me in those days, and I'm a stroke neurologist by background, that there one day would be a discussion about platform trials in acute stroke, I would have thought, what are you smoking? Can't be. And yet you have a review article here that is dealing with exact that topic, where 20 years earlier we wrote futuristic papers after the trial that we had done was over, pontificating about what would be nice to have. So we've come a long way forward. And of course, I've shown the circle around the GBM Agile. Here's a paper that is discussing this. So what an advance we've made. However, I now want to ask you a question that I have heard being talked about. Some people having serious doubts that simulations is actually a credible thing. For instance, can we believe the black box computer that's doing something with complicated algorithms? There might be other statistical arguments. So can we talk a little bit about what concerns might be floating around them there and perhaps deflate them? Kert.
So one thing I should start off with saying, when I started doing this, which was not incredibly long ago, but early 2010s, this was ubiquitous. Justify your type 1 error, is simulation valid? I don't think we get anywhere near that kind of pushback anymore from regulators. There's a guidance document. They deal with how to do simulations. Half of the adaptive guidance is how to write simulations up. So clearly we've progressed. I do think that we certainly need to be careful about saying what simulation is and isn't. We're not predicting the future. We're not predicting whether the drug works. The technical aspects of this are often at heart Monte Carlo integration. So we're doing calculations that are similar to everything that's been done before, are just numerical techniques are different. That does set us up. Andy talked about the 12,000 scenarios. The difficulty is, we have to address one scenario at a time. We need to make sure that there's coverage. The more complex design, there's going to be edge cases that we didn't think about. The standard issue that we have with FDA right now is not, we won't take your simulation. It's, could you simulate the following extra scenarios? Very common request and usually easily addressed. So I think we're making progress there.
Yeah, Tobias.
Just simulation isn't replacing careful thinking. So it's adding to it. So prior to running a simulation, you think about the problem, you understand the problem better, and then you design the simulation study like your statistician's experiment, and the simulation study will provide you new insights if it's properly programmed, for sure. So you need to do some QCs, you need to make some validation steps in there, but it ultimately helps you to understand actually the design for clinical trials. So that's So you need to have both thinking and simulation, I think.
Yeah. I want to take this topic to chat a bit about interacting with health authorities. And Andy, I recall how Susan Ellenberg and you talked about the Aston study and how that was like. But then, of course, when the guidance came out about complex innovative designs, there may have been people who would have said, we really can't understand properly the operating characteristics of the design through simulations. Is it fair to say that over the years, with key experts like Lisa Lavange and Jeanne Woodcock and others, and of course, a lot of experience that have been had with health authorities, there's a much more approachable spirit in those days now when we talk about designs that have had simulations as a background to help put them together.
Well, I think from my experience, there was always a collaborative approach. The problem was that we as statisticians didn't necessarily get in contact with the regulatory statisticians as easily as we should have been able to. Okay, you would meet them occasionally at statistics conferences, but that's not the same as meeting with them to talk about the statistical background of a particular trial that you're wanting to persuade them to consider the design of. And part of the problem, in my experience, was not from the regulator's side. It was from the regulatory affairs departments within the pharmaceutical companies, within the sponsors, who were loath to give up their power in controlling the interactions between scientists from the sponsor and the regulator. So I think the willingness of the regulators was always there. I think it's better now, and clearly the guidance that has been published on complex designs is a great help to encourage the conversation and to allay the fears of the regulatory affairs departments of sponsor companies.
Yeah, and it brings us back to the importance of being very strong in clearly articulating and communicating well with stakeholders, including health authorities, because that's what our discussion is all about. How can we think about empowering ourselves in influencing strategic decision-making around drug development? Same is true, of course, for device development. That's what we're really talking about. And in my experience, having simulations is an enabler for creating an interesting discussion with all the parties around the table. Ina, is that something that you also have experienced and others? Ina?
Absolutely. And I think I want to share a joint experience that I had working in your team, Mike. You probably remember the infamous first CRM design that we tried to kind of do for the first time within the company. And I think you were very generous telling me that I convinced the clinicians, but I think the power was in simulations and that adaptive design software that we had at the moment. I can't remember if it was FACS or its early predecessor, but I think the tide turned when the clinicians saw a data visualization of individual trials that we could play in front of his eyes as a movie. And that gave him a good sense of variability associated with the estimates that we're getting, much better than any type of statistical summary.
Yeah.
So that point has been made many times, speak the language of your audience. But to add a cherry on top of that story, fast forward 10 years or maybe 5, that very same clinician became the champion of adaptive design. And he, in fact, helped me to design another study within Pfizer, implementing CRM design, this time in non-oncology settings. So that's, I think, to me, was a very profound tale. It's not about complex statistics. It's about being thorough. Like, I can't agree more with what Tobias said earlier, that having simulation and fancy toolbox we have now is not an excuse to leave your head somewhere else. It's still more important than ever to distill complex concept into simple terms. You have to be careful doing that.
So we can empower ourselves by sharing experiences and building a network of champions. You mentioned one clinician, once convinced, will go elsewhere and do the same thing. And influencing in that way, I think, is critical. Any others who want to chime in on that last topic? If not, I want to make a quick statement about what we really need to do, and that is to think about the bigger picture. I think Andy and Kert and others, you all made that point. I have a very simplistic graphic here illustrating how initially the red we invest, and then over time, if a development effort is successful, there'll be profits generated by providing the medicine to patients once a label is achieved. But of course, what we need to think about is how can we get the entry point into market for successful projects to an even earlier time point, or below that, how can we get to the right decision, the next in the string of decisions that we need to make to an earlier time point? How can we think about better in terms of maximizing the value created through a new medicine? And how can we do all of this in reducing direct grant costs, being efficient? Those are some critical big picture topics. And of course, we have a big problem in pharma R&D in that the ability for us to predict from early observations to what will eventually happen is very low. But isn't that exactly where some of the skills that we put in here come to the table? But we need to think about that bigger picture and the different scenarios. Something could fail, it could succeed, but ultimately we need to think about how can we maximize value, getting earlier decisions, maximizing value, and doing so in a more efficient manner. Tom.
As we're getting a little bit close to the end, and I have the strong feeling we could carry on for another hour. The nice question has come in, which people might want to address as a sort of last answer, is could people recommend resources for people who are beginners to new to clinical trials or new to designing simulation studies? Do people have any particular tips as to where to go?
Gen AI, sorry to say it, but I was amazed over the last couple of weeks. Writing a Shiny app, you just make one prompt, and then 10 minutes later, you have the Shiny app, which can help you tremendously to display your simulation results. So that could be one thing. If you really need to start it, can you write a good code? But there is good software available. RPEC, for example, it has very strong simulations and good documentation of it. But also like Viele, Berry Consultants, there are a lot of software companies right now available who specialize really on adaptive designs. And big group of statisticians available, I think, in PSI, in also DIA working group, XDIA working group on complex design. So there's a lot available.
Yeah, and by the way, all of your questions, please email them afterwards, and we'll make a log of what come in. We'll also do some post call interactions with you afterwards. Given that indeed we are running short on time, I wanted to again come back to how can we maximize the strategic impact we have on our development strategy. What tips can we give each other and to the audience? And I wanted to highlight on the right, we need to look at the development strategy in a whole, and we need to be clear on what the constraints are. And sometimes each of us work in a bubble that is constrained. But how can we look at the bigger picture? And so I'm just highlighting the many stakeholders to the left that need to be looked at. And I wanted to just invite us around the table to provide examples or tips on what you would do to maximize impact on the strategic thinking towards a development strategy.
The assumption log, understanding the risks, because the development process is to de-risk your big investments. So the point, you can simulate everything, the whole program altogether, but you really need to understand the risks which are and which you need to move out of the way. and then designing the development program to address those risks. And simulations helps there. But this kind of thing of expected net present value, just looking for this one number again, this is possibly misleading, because you really need to think about those risks and how to best address them each by one. It's like an adaptive process, which we are doing, an adaptive design. It's our development program.
Yeah. Ina, anything to add?
I would say simplistic answer would be keep the big picture in mind, which is what you just said, Mike. I think that means different things depending what level you're at. When I was at the earlier stage of my career where I was doing primarily technical work, I was relying on project statistician to fill in a lot of these gaps, and I could not possibly go to all the meetings where the big picture was discussed. But I think the point is you still can make an effort to learn, and eventually you'll start to see the big picture from little bits and pieces. Now that I'm more in a leadership role, I have more of a luxury of seeing the big picture. And I admit it's actually hard. I'm still learning how to balance details with the big pictures. I think it's a continuous learning. Don't be too hard on yourself. Just like we tell our dancing students, keep practicing and competing, even though it's not perfect. I think it's the same here. It's a continuous improvement because the picture is big and it's getting more complex by the day.
Kurt, anything to add from your end?
I'm just going to say, aside from the big pharma perspective, it's worth knowing your audience. We work with a lot of smaller biotechs, and their risks benefit profile may look different when you only have one drug, as opposed to you're thinking of, what do I do now when I have lots of options? Same, in a pandemic setting, we've had different goals. It's worth sitting down with everybody and, as what this slide says, what does success look like can look very different for different companies, different governments, different stakeholders.
Yes. Andy, from your perspective.
No, I think that last point is very important. It's clear that the small biotechs, you need to treat them differently to big pharma. I mean, for big pharma, it's to optimize the portfolio. And for small biotech, that isn't what they're interested in. They're wanting to gain enough information to be able to sell themselves to big pharma, and that's a very different objective.
So being clear as to what the objective is from the get-go, I think, is critical.
Yes.
I think it was Don who first introduced me to this notion, the yellow sticker development strategy. If it's patchwork, as opposed to looking at what's the bigger picture that we need to have in mind, and then be proactive in trying to get a product that looks really slick at the other end. Kurt, you already mentioned about the ABCD, but I want to complete our session here today on the influencing and communicating skills. So this is not perhaps highly technically, statistically relevant, but so important. Andy, you have been critical in getting the adaptive design that we did for dose response finding, accepted within senior management, within the company that we worked for, but also to external parties. Any last words from you on the impact of influencing, communicating, and how you train that?
I think mentoring is extremely important, or to actually see people in action, interacting with the decision makers. And I don't think the more junior statisticians get enough opportunity to see that. I think that's important, that we need to help our junior colleagues by exhibiting the behaviors and the communication skills that are necessary.
Yeah. I can't believe that we're out of time, and we haven't even got through a third of the slides that I had prepared. But I want to maybe end this. I know, Andy. Andy was always famous saying, "Oh, this guy comes with 250 slides." The Socratic method, is famous for starting by asking the right questions, encourage critical thinking. You can look at the slide, everything it says. My experience is that the mere fact of having a simulation effort is creating an environment where you deploy the Socratic method in action. And so I want to thank Tom for inviting us. I want to thank all the panelists for making time. And I want to thank the audience for participating. And here is a way for you to get in touch. And Tom, maybe we need more time and continue this. Big thank you, everybody.
Yes, I second that. Thanks to everybody for giving up your time for this and creating such a fantastic discussion. And there is plenty more, and maybe we do this again someday.
All the best. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.